Welcome to episode 68 of the MMA Rundown podcast. First thing we'll be talking about today is going to be the main event between Robert Whittaker and Darren Till. That Robert Whittaker was able to win by a unanimous decision, 3 rounds to 2 on all three judges' scorecards. So I'll just break down that fight and how I thought it should have been scored. We then have a recap of the full UFC Fight Island 3 event, which had, I believe, 15 fights on it, so I'll just go through all the different fights on there. Then I'll talk about Dan Hardy. There were a few different things with Dan Hardy, so I'll just kind of wrap it up into just this one topic here, but there was what happened on the actual night of the fight where he was getting in Herb Dean's face, which I thought was a little bit out of line. And then he had some other things that were pissing some people off throughout the week. One of them was him answering a question from a 15-year-old who was asking if it was too late for him to get into MMA, and the other one was just him breaking down Paulo Costa in his game and not necessarily being all too positive about it and getting some blowback for that as well. Next topic to talk about would then be a preview of the UFC card that's going to be coming up next week. That's going to be headlined by Shahbazyan and Brunson. I'll talk about a pretty big fight, at least in terms of name value in boxing. It was just announced with Mike Tyson and Roy Jones Jr. It's supposed to be an exhibition, so I'll just talk about that whole situation. There are a couple really big names, both from jiu-jitsu and wrestling, who either have announced that they are going to MMA now, or that they are strongly considering it very soon. So that would be Buchecha from Jiu-Jitsu and then Frank Chamizo from Wrestling. So I'll talk about both of their specific situations and what to expect from them. Recap the BJJ Stars event, which was really good. That just happened yesterday. And then also preview Who's Number One, which is coming up next week, or I believe it's coming on Friday. That'll be headlined by Gordon Ryan and Ronaldo Jr. And then recap the Flowrestling Dake versus Chamizo card that had a few hiccups in it, but ended up still having a lot of really good matches there as well. So back to the topic, we have Robert Whittaker versus Darren Till. And as far as how this match ended up working out, I got to say I was pretty impressed with Robert Whittaker in terms of him being able to make some really quick adjustments to Darren Till, because my concern for Whittaker in this fight was that if this fight is just a technical striking match, that Darren Till would probably have the edge there. And through the first round, that appeared to be what was going to happen. So Darren Till, for the most part, was outlanding Robert Whittaker. He was being very successful with his feints in terms of keeping Whittaker at bay. Was finding a home for the left hand a lot, which is Darren Till's best weapon. So that wasn't a huge surprise, and even was able to drop Robert Whittaker when Whittaker lunged in with a lead left hook. Till was able to drop him with a rear left elbow. So things looked like they were going pretty well for Darren Till, but a couple adjustments that Whittaker was able to make really made a huge difference in here. And for the most part, this fight was a southpaw in Darren Till versus orthodox fighter in Robert Whittaker. And as I had mentioned last week with the Figueiredo versus Benavidez situation, when you have southpaw versus orthodox, the southpaw's going to be looking for the straight left. The orthodox guy is often going to be looking for the straight right. In the Figueiredo-Benavidez case, Figueiredo was able to find that straight right multiple times, was able to drop Benavidez multiple times, and ended up finishing him as a result. In this case, and part of the reason why was because Benavidez kept circling in towards that right hand. In this case, the left hand was doing pretty well for Darren Till early, but Whittaker made the adjustment of not circling towards that left hand and circling towards Till's power, and instead he was circling away from it. And so for Darren Till, that sort of put him in a position where it's like, okay, well, if Whittaker's going to keep circling towards my right side, I'm going to have to offer something from the right side, whether it's going to be with the lead right hook, whether it's going to be with the right kick, something to make him pay for constantly circling in that same direction. And for the most part, though Till was throwing the jab early and finding a home for it early and trying to use it to set up some of his shots, for Robert Whittaker, he was able to successfully land enough left hooks over top of that jab to at least slow down Darren Till and make him really consider when he was going to throw that jab and when he was going to kind of keep it up defensively. And that really helped a lot, because over the course of the fight, Darren Till really wasn't that aggressive from his right side as the fight moved on. And we remember the knockout that Darren Till suffered against Jorge Masvidal, where Masvidal came in with that left hook over the top, was able to knock him out. And for much of this fight, Robert Whittaker was looking to use that exact same punch. He was constantly swinging in with that lead left hook. The one time he got dropped in the first round actually was him coming in, lunging with that left hook and ended up getting caught. But for the most part, his aggression and him being able to quickly make up space with that left hook did enough to keep Darren Till at bay on the right side. It did enough to keep him from constantly throwing out the jab, from constantly throwing out punches on the lead hand. He was concerned about the left hook of Robert Whittaker, and it really slowed him down there. So as a result, for much of the fight, you had Darren Till who wanted to set up the left hand, but Whittaker kept circling away from it. Till wanted to kind of corral him into the left hand, but again, he was kind of concerned about when to throw the right hand because he was worried about getting countered with the left hook. So it really made the strike counts for Darren Till in the later rounds pretty low on like a strike per minute basis. Overall, throughout the entire course of the fight, over the course of the full 25 minutes, Darren Till landed 50 total strikes, which averages 2 per minute. And I think a big reason why so few strikes were landed, especially later on in the fight, is because he wanted to hit him with the left hand. Whittaker was constantly circling away from it, so it wasn't always the best time to throw a left hand blindly. And to throw the right hand to kind of corral him into the left hand was a bit of a risky proposition, so he didn't really do it as much as he probably would have liked. So first round definitely goes to Darren Till because he had the knockdown. I think the strike counts are pretty close. I think Till might have actually landed more strikes anyway, but having the knockdown definitely took the round for him. In the second round, he got knocked down pretty quickly. Whittaker landed a really big left hook. That wasn't the shot that knocked Till down, but it did look like it hurt him. But then Whittaker then lunged in with an overhand right. Didn't look like it landed completely clean, but I think Till was probably hurt a little bit already from the left hook that landed just before it, and that was able to knock him down. Took a few shots while he was off his back, but was eventually able to get back up. Did take a pretty big risk in terms of sort of giving up his back and then trying to get up from there. Again, sort of goes back to last week where I was talking about the Benavidez versus Figueiredo match, where there are people who wrestle or people who have wrestling backgrounds or people who try to emulate that style, where their way of getting back up isn't necessarily going to be to elevate you with a butterfly hook or kick away as much as it's just going to be to like give up the back and then try to explode up. And against really high-level jiu-jitsu guys, sometimes that's a really bad idea. That really worked against Joseph Benavidez, where he's getting his back taken, getting flattened out, and then having to fight off choke attempts and fight off punches that are coming from behind him. For Darren Till, in this case, he was able to get away and didn't really have to suffer any consequences for it, but it was a bit of a risky maneuver for him to do that. Ended up working out. But then rounds 3 and 4, a lot of the same. Even through 5, it was a lot of the same, where Darren Till was looking to set up the left hand, constantly had Whittaker circling away from it. Whittaker would sort of like be getting pushed back for most of the time, but then would sort of lunge in with a few shots here and there. But again, Whittaker was landing more than Till was. Till was looking to set up the left hand, having trouble because his opponent was circling away from him, and he didn't want to overuse his right hand and get caught with another huge left hook. So again, pretty technical rounds, pretty close rounds, but I would say that Whittaker definitely got 2 because he had the knockdown, definitely got 3. Feel like he got 4 as well. And then 5, he was ahead for the most part. And late in that round, Till landed another really big rear left elbow. And it caused a really big cut on the ear of Robert Whittaker. Whittaker was then able to take him down pretty quickly after that. Didn't do a whole lot of damage on the ground, but was able to control that position for the time being. Round ends, I think the official strike count on that was 19-12 for Whittaker. And it sort of brings up a question that you hear a lot of it oftentimes around fights with the Diaz brothers, although with those guys not being terribly active lately, you hear a little bit less than you used to. But a topic of conversation that came up a lot with Nate Diaz in the past was that because he has so much scar tissue, that he might take a punch that really isn't like all that damaging or isn't going to like put him in a position where he's near getting finished. But because of all the scar tissue, it's going to open up a cut and it's going to make it look a lot worse than it probably really is. And so from a judging standpoint, when you see a guy get cut off of like a punch that isn't necessarily a punch that's going to stun him or knock him down, do you give that more credit because it did draw blood? Do you not give it any extra credit because it drew blood? Like it's sort of tough to tell because if you're working towards a finish, the idea is that when you're hitting someone, you're kind of stunning them, you're concussing them, you're getting to the point where they're losing their balance, they're falling down, even losing consciousness. And a lot of times when there are shots that cut people, sometimes they are also getting stunned from those shots, but sometimes it's just a shot that hits like most other shots, but it just so happened that the skin wasn't able to stay together. A cut was created, and then they start bleeding. And so you kind of have to wonder, well, how does that get scored there? So in the Diaz fights, there were some times where people felt like, you know what, like, yes, he was getting pretty bloody there, but the shot that landed that caused it really wasn't all that damaging, and as a result, you feel like he kind of got screwed by the judges because they gave the blood too much credit. In this case, it's sort of tough to tell because, again, had Whittaker not been cut there, do we give the round to Till? Does anyone give the round to Till? I feel like probably not. Because he was cut, though, do people feel like giving the round to Till? I think a lot more people did feel like that round should have gone to Till as a result of the cut. It's sort of hard to say. I'm still not exactly sure where that cut was. Like, was that behind the ear? Was it, like, in the ear? Like, it's sort of weird to tell where the blood was coming from directly. So for me, since I already had 3 rounds for Robert Whittaker, it's not as though, like, deciding whether or not that cut steals a round makes a difference in terms of who I'd pick in this round. But it does bring up an interesting question that I think deserves a little bit more conversation than what was given to it. But either way, whether you give that round to Till or not, I still would have had Whittaker winning at least 3 rounds, if not 4, and so then he would get the win. So for Darren Till, over the course of the fight, he did take a lot of leg kicks. It was kind of surprising how effective Robert Whittaker was at landing outside kicks to the lead leg of Till, landing to his right leg. A couple of those kicks as well were something like those side kicks to the knee, and from what it sounds like, I think Darren Till did injure his knee as a result of eating at least one of those kicks. So he's probably not going to be back right away. So for him, it's kind of tough to match him up with someone else if his knee got blown out like he says it was, because that's probably going to take him out for at least 6 to 9 months. So some of the guys like a Jack Hermanson, for example, or Jared Cannonier, who's sitting around the top of the division, you're probably not going to match him up with either of them if he's going to be out for that long. For Whittaker, he's definitely going to want some time to heal after this fight. It was a pretty tough fight. Did get knocked down at one point, had a pretty bad cut as well. So for him, does he get the next title fight against Israel Adesanya? That would make sense if you were the UFC. If Adesanya does get the win, assuming he beats Costa. Even if he doesn't, Whittaker had a nice little run in at the top. So for him to get a win over Till and then go right back in the title, go back into a title fight, that makes sense. It might not necessarily be fair to Jared Cannonier, who pretty much had earned a title fight and then gotten injured. But I could see them doing that. If you're the UFC, you're probably looking at how they were able to sell an entire stadium for Adesanya versus Whittaker the first time. And the assumption is if Adesanya wins this fight over Costa, and you're able to have crowds by the time that they're ready to do the rematch, so that would be the fight to make. If they aren't able to do crowds in New Zealand or Australia, would that affect Whittaker getting a title shot, especially if Adesanya is the champion? I think that's actually an interesting thing that no one is really bringing up right now, and it's looking pretty far in the future, but it does seem like that's a relevant factor, because I think if you can't do crowds in Australia or New Zealand, then putting Whittaker back in there against Adesanya this quickly might not be as interesting of a proposition for the UFC as it would be if they are. If they are, obviously, you're probably going to be able to sell out the entire stadium and sell out 50,000 seats again. If not, then you're having to sell a rematch in a fight where it was a pretty dominant win by Israel Adesanya, and I think in that case the UFC might look to go other ways with it. But either way, Whittaker's going to have some time to heal up. The division has a handful of really good contenders right now. Hermanson, I don't know that I see him like... He's definitely going to have one more fight before he gets to a title. Jared Cannonier, depending on timing, he might be able to roll right into a title shot right away, depending on when he's ready to get back, and depending on how quickly the winner of Costa versus Adesanya is willing to get back in there as well. Costa obviously has the current title shot, so it'll be interesting to see what's next for these guys. But if Whittaker, it's tough because again, I think if Australia and New Zealand are ready by like January 1, for example, for them to get back to normal and be able to do full events with full crowds, then assuming that Israel Adesanya beats Costa, I think Whittaker is probably going to get the next title fight. If Costa wins, that makes it a little bit interesting. I don't know if you give Adesanya an immediate rematch depending on how that fight goes. Do you Cannonier the fight? Just because that'd be a really interesting style matchup between two guys who hit really hard. That would definitely make things pretty interesting as well, but I think for right now, Robert Whittaker's best bet is just going to be to wait and see how things play out, both in terms of Australia and New Zealand allowing people into the country and also allowing large events to take place, large sporting events to take place. And then also who wins between Costa and Adesanya is definitely going to play a big role in terms of who's next for a title fight after that. Next fight to look at is a bit of a legends fight between Shogun Rua and Rogerio Nogueira. This fight ended up going to a split decision that Shogun was able to get the victory in. All three judges had it 29-28. One of them had it for Nogueira. Two of them had it for Shogun. I wasn't watching it close enough where I could be a judge on it. I think Shogun probably had the first round. Second round, we were seeing a lot more success from Rogerio landing that left hand against Shogun. This was another fight where you had a lefty versus the righty, and in this case, the lefty was having a lot more success with his rear hand than the righty was. Shogun was having some success getting takedowns, but wasn't doing a ton from top when he had them. On the feet, for the most part, it seemed like Nogueira was having the longer stretches of success, but Shogun was also having his moments as well. But in the end, Shogun gets the win and Rogerio retires on a loss, unfortunately for him, but it was still a pretty fun fight regardless. Fight before that was Fabricio Verdun versus Alexander Gustafsson. This was... It was interesting in how it ended the way that it did. I think a lot of people are really down on Alexander Gustafsson for the way that he lost, and they feel like he just isn't himself again. It's sort of tough to say because on one hand, with Gustafsson, even if you assumed that we had the best Gustafsson here against Fabricio Verdun, it's been pretty well known with Gustafsson that he's not the best at fighting off of his back. If you look at some of his recent losses that weren't looking all that good for him, the loss to John Jones, where Jones was able to take him down and just beat him up while Gus was on bottom. Anthony Smith, when he was able to get him down, was able to flatten him out, take his back, and sink in a rear naked choke. And I think the assumption would be that if Fabricio Verdum gets on top of him, he's also going to have similar success. Definitely would have no less success than a John Jones or an Anthony Smith would. So even if you're assuming you're getting the best Gus, if the fight gets to that position, you aren't really expecting a ton from Alexander Gustafsson. Like at best, you're expecting him to either just stall it out and get through the round, or find someone to get back up. But it's not as though you're expecting him to win that position. You're just kind of expecting him to survive it at best. And even if you think back to Alexander Gustafsson's career, like he was a guy who was sort of new to the UFC, had decent boxing, had that fight against Phil Davis. Phil Davis was able to take him down and just beat the crap out of him. So he decided, you know what, this isn't cool. Like I need to find a way to be better about dealing with wrestlers. So he spent a lot of time with Phil Davis, and that was sort of like a cool story around him. Like, wow, he gets beat by a really good wrestler, spends a lot of time with the wrestler, really improves his wrestling. And from there, the greatness that we got from Gustafsson from there was largely him being able to avoid takedowns, keep fights on the feet, and be able to outbox guys. But the guys who were able to find ways to take him down were still able to give him trouble. And so, at least within this fight, even if you're assuming that you're getting a really good Gustafsson, you know that if this fight ends up with Gustafsson on his back, it's not going to be great for him, even if he's really sharp and even if you're getting a really good version of him. As far as how the fight started, it was fairly predictable. Gustafsson was starting off just kind of pumping out the jab, trying to get his range, doing a good job of moving laterally, so it's not as though he was easy to take down. About a minute and a half in, Verdum shoots in on an outside single leg with his head outside. Really wasn't that great of a takedown attempt. Gus defended it really well. To the point where Verdum then rolled onto his back and sort of like rolled into a half guard position. From there, that's one of those things that's unique about jiu-jitsu guys that you won't necessarily see with a wrestler, is that if you stuff a single leg takedown the way that Gustafsson did against a wrestler, the wrestler's probably just going to try to disengage and look to get a better shot the next time, or at least maybe like try to chain wrestle into a different type of takedown. Whereas a guy like Fabricio Verdum, a guy like Damian Maia even, they'll just pull into half guard and look to use a half guard sweep to set up another wrestling attack, or to set up another sweep attempt for them to come up on top. And from there you have Fabricio Verdum in bottom of half guard, looking to come up on a single leg. And it sort of put Gus in this odd position where it's like, on one hand you can defend that specific position the proper way, which is effectively to engage in a jiu-jitsu position with Fabricio Verdum, or you can just try to like pretty much just run out of that position and just like try to drag your leg out of there and just get out of there free, which isn't the proper technical way to handle that. If you decide to defend it like a jiu-jitsu position, then in all likelihood, even if you settle him down and he ends up stuck in half guard, well then you're on top of Fabricio Verdum, and Verdum's got control of one of your legs in half guard, so that's not an ideal position to be in. But on the other hand, if you try to just run out of that position and you aren't successful and Fabricio Verdum's able to follow you up, get the takedown, and then latch onto your back, that's also a really bad position. So it's kind of like one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situations. Ideally, you're going to have enough confidence in your jiu-jitsu game where you can just kind of like stuff them from half guard, stay on top, land a few shots, and just kind of like pick your spots in terms of when you're ready to try to escape that position, or if you want to just kind of settle your weight on top, don't take any risks, and either hope that the ref stands you up or just land enough shots from top that you're able to stay active and be able to win a round without doing a whole lot to improve position. But instead, he just tries to dash out of the position without really any technique, just tries to sort of like use his speed to get out of there. It's early in the fight, so it's not as though his legs are super sweaty or anything where he's going to slip out that easy. So Verdum follows him up on the single leg, is able to trip him, gets to his back, gets both hooks in, quickly looks to switch to an armbar, and then is able to eventually roll that armbar over and get a finish on it. So for Fabricio Verdum, pretty big name for him to get a win over, especially with this being his last fight on his UFC contract. I don't think he plans on returning to the UFC, especially after the UFC did not release him after his 2-year suspension for steroids. I guess in theory this is a much better looking performance than the one that he had against Alexei Oleinik. A lot of people are saying that the Oleinik fight was sort of an aberration and that he's a much better fighter than that showed, and that this fight against Gustafsson proves it. It's sort of hard to say just because Oleinik and Gustafsson have significantly different styles. Oleinik is a lot more willing to fight you on the ground. He's a lot more well-versed in terms of grappling. So for him, he also had Verdum make a similar decision where Verdum would have his back, and rather than just trying to control the position and then just fight in and work his way towards a rear naked choke, Verdum would sort of go for an armbar and give up the position. But Oleinik would be able to successfully defend the armbar, so then Verdum would end up on bottom. Whereas here, Gustafsson was not able to successfully defend the armbar, and so there wasn't really any of Verdum ending up on bottom in that case because Verdum had just gotten the win. So we were sort of seeing some similarities in this fight and the Olenek fight. It's just that Olenek was able to defend a whole lot better than Gustafsson was. So it's hard to say that the Verdum that we just saw right now is a similar Verdum to the one who was a UFC champion. There wasn't enough on the feet to really make too many big judgments in terms of how good his striking looked. Granted, Gustafsson landed some nice shots, was able to do a decent job with the jab early, had a nice little exchange in the pocket where it looked like he landed a pretty nice uppercut as well. But it's not as though I'm like really buying into this idea that Fabricio Verdum looked like a champion last night. But he did what he had to do to get the win, so you have to give him credit for that. As far as where he goes from here, it's possible he goes to ONE FC, and then he can get back on the sauce and do whatever the hell he wants. He can go to Bellator. There's some talk about what it would be like if he fought Ryan Bader, how that matchup would go. It'd be one I'd be interested to see. I think Bader would probably be more willing, if he gets in the exact same type of position that Gustafsson did, I think Bader would be more willing to stay on top and just sort of land some short punches and be really conservative in his position. He'd also be tougher to take down than Gustafsson is. And then on the feet, less technical boxer than Gustafsson is, but he definitely hits a lot harder. So that could also make for a pretty tough matchup. He's also really quick as well. So I think Bader would probably win that match if they had it, but I don't know that that's a match we're going to get. But either way, big win for Verdum. For Gustafsson, coming up to heavyweight and losing to Verdum, who was ranked outside the top 15, I believe. Not ideal for him. I'm not sure what his plans are right now, if he wants to just keep at it and stay at heavyweight and not have to cut weight anymore, because I know that the weight cut was something that bothered him a lot. That's up to him. It's not as though it looked like he was like undersized in there by any means. I think there was like a 2-pound difference between him and Verdum in that fight, but the skill differential on the ground definitely showed through, and that didn't work out all that well for him. But with Verdum leaving the division, it's not as though there are a lot of guys left who are significantly better in jiu-jitsu than Alexander Gustafsson is at the heavyweight division. There aren't a lot of significantly high, or there's not a lot of high-level Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belts in the heavyweight division as it is, and losing Verdum is definitely going to take that threat out of it. Fairly similar for wrestlers. Daniel Cormier is going to be retiring soon. Stipe is the champion. Curtis Blades is in the division. That could be a tough one for Alexander Gustafsson as well. But it's not as though like guys who are going to out-grapple Alexander Gustafsson are just floating around that heavyweight division. There are a few guys who could potentially offer that risk to him. But we're losing Verdum right now. We're losing Daniel Cormier. So it seems like there are plenty of matchups for Alexander Gustafsson that are a lot more friendly to his style, even within the top 15. So for him, if he wants to stick around and take on some of those guys, probably wouldn't be the worst idea. Fight before that was Marina Rodriguez versus Carla Esparza. A really big opportunity for Marina. She had worked her way into the top 10, looked really good, even against some decent wrestlers in the past. And there were some thoughts that if she was able to run through Carla Esparza here, that she could be working her way into the title picture really soon. Fortunately for her, wasn't able to do so. We'd seen in the past that she was successful defending takedowns up against the fence. Carla Esparza was very good about being able to get takedowns in space here and not even have to go against the fence, whether it was shooting singles or doubles or whatever she was shooting within the middle of the octagon she was having success with. Once she would get on top, there would be times when Marina would land some decent shots from bottom, but for the most part, Carla was just winning while Carla was on top. So I would definitely say that the first round, Esparza was initially on top, but Marina was able to reverse her, and once she got on top, was able to land some pretty heavy shots, and I think did enough to steal that round. Second round, Esparza was winning pretty much the whole way through until the end when she went for a straight ankle lock, which, by the way, actually was pretty close. If you looked at the ankle of Marina Rodriguez, it was extended out pretty good, but Marina was able to land a really nice, a couple, I think, actually. She landed a couple of punches to Carla Esparza's face that were really hard, while Esparza was trying to straighten out that ankle lock, so Esparza made the decision there to protect her head rather than to try to finish all the way through. Probably not the worst idea. But then from there, Marina's able to get on top and then lands some more damaging shots at the end of the round. Definitely very memorable to end a round like that, but I still think that Esparza did enough to win that round. If some people felt like Marina did enough to steal that round at the end there, I can kind of get it, and this fight did go to a split decision, so I'm sure that one of the judges felt that way as well. But in the third round, it was pretty much all Carla Esparza was able to get her takedowns, end up on top. Was a little bit more conservative from top, didn't really want to risk giving up position as much, and as a result was able to win that round. So I had it rounds 2 and 3 for Esparza, round 1 for Marina. One of the judges had 30-27. I don't know how they saw that, how they would have given the first round to Esparza, but the other two were 29-28. One probably giving Marina the second round, the other one giving Esparza the second round. So for Esparza, puts her on a nice little win streak. I think at this point it'd be fair for her to have another fight against a top 5 contender. I think she wants to have a rematch with Claudia Gadelha, because the last time they fought, it was a pretty close decision that I think Esparza felt she won, and I think a lot of other people agreed with her on that. So I think she wants to get that win back. But for her, she's definitely in a position now where she's going to be fighting some of the top contenders, and if she can keep winning, may find herself in the top picture soon. Now, granted, I don't think she's going to beat some of those top contenders, especially since a lot of them are girls she's fought before and hasn't looked great against, including Joanna. But for her, this is a good position to be in, and getting that win really means a lot for her. For Marina, it's sort of tough because it did expose some holes in her game, specifically with the wrestling in open space. Now, granted, it's not as though there are a ton of girls who can wrestle in open space quite as well as Carla Esparza can in the division. So for her, that's still something that she's going to want to work on. She's going to want to work on fighting off her back as well and really improve there. But for her, pushes her back a little bit, but I don't know that she should be outside of the top 10 after this loss, especially since the girl she lost to was ranked ahead of her. And she'll have to fight some other girls who are sort of like in that 6 to 12 range, maybe even like 6 to 14 or so. And if she can get some more wins and show really good grappling or at least good wrestling defense in the meantime, I think she'll find herself in a similar position that she found herself in here, where she's able to go against some of the better contenders in the division and work her way back up towards the top again. The fight before that was Gadzi Murov Antigala versus Paul Craig. It's just crazy to me how Paul Craig's constantly hitting triangle chokes on these Russian wrestler guys, and they just don't seem to care. It's really interesting. Antigala takes Craig down, and Craig's setup, I mean, it was a decent setup. Like he had wrist control on him and was able to kind of do a push triangle from there. But it seemed like Antigala really wasn't all that concerned about it. Even when the triangle was locked in, Antigala, rather than trying to defend the position, was just throwing a bunch of arm punches as Craig was tightening the choke, and eventually Craig's able to get the tap. So for Paul Craig, big win. The win over Ankalaev, I think, is going to appear to be his biggest win that he's had, because I think Ankalaev is really going to work his way up that light heavyweight division. I don't know so much about Antigala. I don't know that Antigala is going to be a guy who works his way into the rankings at any point. But it is interesting how Paul Craig seems to be triangling a lot of really good guys and then losing to some guys who really aren't all that great, who have much better strategies for fighting against him. Fight before that was Peter Sabati versus Alex Oliveira. Oliveira had a lot of success with his kicks to the body, also was having a decent amount of success with his eye pokes and kicks to the nuts as well. But for the most part, throughout this fight, was able to outland Sabata and was able to get a unanimous decision win, 30-27 on all three judges' scorecards. Fight before that is one that I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into than most of the other fights, just because of who was in it. So it was Khamzat Chimaev versus Reese McKee. Chimaev just absolutely dominated this fight, was able to get a takedown early on. I guess to McKee's credit that we didn't see in the John Phillips fight is that in the Phillips fight, when Chimaev shot him for a takedown, he pretty much instantly got it. In this fight, McKee at least defended it enough to the point where he was able to get up against the fence, at which point we got to see some chain wrestling out of Chimaev, just because he actually had to do it. No need to chain wrestle if you can get a takedown on your first shot. But Chimaev was able to get him down. From there, just constant ground and pound, constantly improving position, was trapping wrist, was landing nice ground and pound, was getting into positions where he was getting close to finishing chokes. McKee would be able to get out of him, but then would have to eat a bunch of shots as a result for doing so. Just overall complete domination from Khamzat Chimaev. Ends up eventually getting a TKO where McKee had taken like 60 unanswered strikes. Was pretty much mounted up against the fence, and the ref's like, dude, you got to improve position, McKee wasn't able to, and so they called a stop to the fight. And so for Chimaev, this is his second fight in 10 days on Fight Island. Both fights were just complete and utter domination, one at middleweight against John Phillips, and now one at welterweight against Reese McKee. And there's a lot of talk about him being like a welterweight Khabib, talk about him being a guy who can hang with some of the top 10 guys already, and it's just a matter of time until he gets those opportunities. I think some people see him as like a future champion, as a guy who could potentially like hang with the best guys right now. As far as what I've seen from him and how good I think he can be, it's sort of tough to tell, because for one, we haven't seen much of his striking. All I really know of his striking is what I hear based off of people watching his sparring sessions, which is relatively positive. But again, we haven't really seen much of it in the cage, and that's not really something that you can blame him for. There's no need to strike any longer than you need to if you can take someone down pretty much immediately and then just dominate them on the ground. So as far as where his striking is, it's sort of hard to tell. I think one of the things that the UFC really likes to do, and I talked about this last week as well with with Saryukin, is that when you have a really dominant wrestler, the UFC really likes to put those guys up against guys who are also really good wrestlers, or guys who have really high-level jiu-jitsu backgrounds. And then if you put a guy like Chimaev up against a high-level jiu-jitsu guy, then the idea is either he's going to prove that he can do what he does on the ground even against the best grapplers, or he's going to be like, you know what, maybe it's not a good idea for me to take this guy down. Let me actually show off my striking. Davi Ramos is one of those guys who gets a lot of these types of matchups where he had that matchup with Saryukin, he had that matchup with Islam Makhachev. Now, granted, he's at lightweight. He's not going to be getting that matchup with Chimaev as well. But it'll be interesting to see if the UFC tries to make that type of a matchup for Chimaev moving forward, where it's like, okay, well, we've seen a lot from him on the ground. Either he's going to do this to a high-level jiu-jitsu guy, or he's going to do this to a high-level wrestler, or he's going to have to actually strike, and we're going to be able to see that. So I think in terms of what he's going to get next, it's probably going to be that type of a matchup where he's going to be put up against a high-level grappler, and we're either going to see him strike on the feet, or we're going to see him beat a high-level grappler at their own game. Either way, you could learn a lot and be really impressed with Chimaev based off of that. Reese McKee, I don't know a ton about him, but there wasn't really any indication I got from this fight that he's a high-level grappler. I know for a fact John Phillips is not a high-level grappler. So that specific type of test I think is one that the UFC is going to want to get out of him first. Now, as far as who fits that bill at this point, that's sort of hard to tell. I think Claudio Silva might be the guy for them to do it with. I don't know how active Silva's looking to be, but I think in terms of being an unranked guy who's got really good jiu-jitsu, that'd probably be one that would make sense. But you're not going to put him up against Damian Maia. I think Maia has one fight left, and he's looking to fight against Diego Sanchez. Gilbert Burns, former world champion, but he's going to be fighting the current world champion. So that's not going to be, and by current world champion, I mean current UFC world champion, not current jiu-jitsu world champion. You have Rafael Dos Anjos, but I don't think they're going to make that fight right now, and Dos Anjos is more known for his top game than his bottom game. We've seen him struggle against other wrestlers. So I don't know if that's going to be the fight that they make. So as far as who's available for Chimaev to really fit into that bill, you either have to go with a high-level wrestler, or you have to go with someone like a Claudio Silva, someone who's got a really good jiu-jitsu background, just to kind of see how he manages to play his game against someone like that. So there's more that could be learned there. But as far as what I've seen from him on the ground, I got to say I'm pretty impressed. Very good about being able to fight post, being able to get wrist control. Really good at mixing his ground and pound with his guard passing, similar to what we see from Khabib. A lot of the techniques that we've seen from Khabib over time, we haven't yet seen from Chimaev. Doesn't mean he doesn't have them, but when you finish fights as quickly as Chimaev has been able to do, you're not going to be able to show everything that you got. So can't really hold that against him. The only thing that I really noticed about Chimaev that I could even say as a negative is sort of like the same thing that I've been saying about Khabib as being an issue for Khabib. And the big issue I point out with Khabib is that oftentimes when he gets guys down on the ground and then he improves position, it's not as though it's like what you would expect from a Damian Maia or a high-level jiu-jitsu guy, where it's like once they get to a certain position, you're never getting a better position on them, with the idea being like if you get taken down, you're never getting back up. If they pass your full guard into a half guard, you're never getting your full guard back. If they pass your half guard to side control, you're never getting any kind of guard back. They mount you, you're never even getting back to side control. They get your back, they're stuck on your back until they get a finisher, until the round ends. Ideally, that's the progression you want to see from a high-level grappler. And with Khabib, oftentimes he'll be able to pass guard, but then he'll end up having that guard recovered on him. He'll get to someone's back. They'll be able to get back to a turtle position without the hooks. He'll mount someone. They'll be able to get back to a guard. And while he's still controlling the fight the whole time, when you're dealing with some of the highest level guys in the world, giving them a chance to be in a guard again, or giving them a chance to get back up to their feet, or giving them a chance to survive a round and then be able to get back up in the next round and force you to have to take them down again. You're just creating opportunities where they're going to have a chance to play their game and be able to beat you. And even with Khabib, we saw in that fight against Dustin Poirier that was mostly dominant for him. Had Dustin's back, had a couple of choke attempts in the first round, wasn't able to finish. As a result, second round comes around, and then Dustin Poirier is able to land a huge left hand that has Khabib stunned and has him with his own back up against the fence as he's trying to recover. Then in the third round, Khabib goes for another takedown and ends up having to fight his way out of a tight guillotine choke. And these are all things that wouldn't necessarily have had to have happened had Khabib been able to just run through him in the first round and be able to get the finish when he had the dominant positions he had. So for Chimaev, the only thing you can really hold against him, and again, this expectation of someone being able to constantly improve position and never allow their opponent to recover, that's an expectation you have for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world champions. That's something that you look at for a Damian Maia. So expecting the same thing for a Khabib, or expecting it for a Chimaev, you're holding incredibly high expectations, and I don't know that's the most realistic thing to expect the same type of control and pressure that you get from a Rodolfo Vieira, from a Jacare Souza, from a Damian Maia. Expecting Chimaev to have that same exact thing, but if you're pointing to what the ideal would be, that's the ideal. So for Chimaev, there were cases, especially in this McKee fight, where he had McKee bounded, then McKee would get back to half guard. He had McKee's back, then he would lose the hooks and sort of have to settle back to another position. But even in that case, and we saw that in the first round against John Phillips, he was still putting himself in positions to get close to finishes. You could have argued that a ref could have stepped in in the first round of the Phillips fight and been like, look, this guy's taking too many unanswered shots. We're going to have to call it here. But then was able to take him down really quickly in the second round and was able to find a choke and get a quick finish there. In this fight, McKee wasn't able to escape the first round, so even though McKee was able to escape some bad positions, the attack from Chimaev was just so constant and so aggressive that he was still able to get the finish in the first round. So if there's one thing to point to on Chimaev, I guess it's the same sort of thing that I talked about with Khabib. Obviously, if you're Chimaev and you get to the top of the division, you're going to be fighting guys like Kamaru Usman, who's not going to be the easiest guy to take down all the time, and I would imagine won't be the easiest guy to hold down. Colby Covington, same type of deal. Tyron Woodley, very good wrestler. So it's not as though he's going to have the easiest guys to land takedowns on towards the top of the division. He's going to be dealing with some heavy-handed guys as well, especially at welterweight. So for him, you still, in an ideal world, if you're going to be able to take your opponent down, you want to be able to constantly improve position and constantly work your way towards the finish until you're able to get it. You don't want to get in position like someone's back with the hooks in and have them be able to get out of it. So for him, I guess, if you're looking for room for improvement, that's there. But again, that's the same thing that I say about Khabib Nurmagomedov, and Khabib is like 30-0 and is currently a UFC champion. So it's not as though that's the type of hole in your game that's going to keep you from being a champion or keep you from any kind of greatness. But it's just one of those things where if you're speaking idealistically, that's something that you'd like to see be a little bit better. So can't wait to see Chimaev return. I think the plan is for him to come back on August 15th. I don't know who the UFC is going to match him up with then. That's fairly short notice. I don't know that Claudio Silva is going to be the guy for that. I don't know that they're going to find another high-level jiu-jitsu guy for him, but at least from my standpoint of what type of match I'd like to see next, I would like to see him up against either a high-level wrestler who's going to have trouble taking down and holding down, in theory at least, or a high-level jiu-jitsu guy who, again, in theory, he wouldn't want to take down and play into their game, in theory, but maybe he finds a way to do that and then is able to dominate them sort of in their own domain, which would then be even more impressive for him. On the prelims, we had Francisco Trinaldo versus Jai Herbert. Herbert was winning this fight for the most part, looked a lot quicker than Trinaldo. But then in the third round, takes a really big overhand left to the forehead, which typically getting punched in the forehead is not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of guys don't get knocked down or get their head rattled too badly when they get hit in the forehead. And that's also the hardest bone on the body. So oftentimes if you're punching someone in the forehead, there's a good chance you're going to break your hand. So definitely not an area that people aim for the most part. But with that being said, there have been times where we've seen people get punched in the forehead and then just kind of get flash KO'd or just sort of like put out in odd ways. I think this is the same spot that Chuck Ray Souza was able to land on Chris Weidman on. And in this case, Herbert took the shot to the forehead, pretty much was out on his feet, landed on his back. Was sort of in a weird spot where he had one hand reaching out and then one hand covering his chin. Punch lands on the forehead, and he pretty much goes out in that exact same position where he has one hand covering his chin and then one hand reaching out. So he drops. Francisco Trinaldo then looks to follow up. Notices that Herbert really isn't doing much to defend himself. He's just kind of like stuck in the same exact position that he was in when he got dropped. So Trinaldo was not necessarily eager to throw punches right away. Herb Dean's watching over it. I guess for Herb Dean, and this is one of those things that you have to think about as a ref. As a ref, you want to be the guy who calls a stop to the fight, and at some points it can be kind of annoying when another fighter thinks that he's doing your job for you and he decides to stop before you tell him to stop. The instruction to the fighter is that you continue fighting until the ref steps in to stop the fight. So it's sort of the spot here where if you look at it in a freeze frame, you have Herbert covering up his chin with one hand and then reaching out to sort of like frame away with his other hand. And if you're just looking at the hands, it does seem like it would look like he's defending himself on a freeze frame. You have Trinaldo, who's effectively trying to do Herb Dean's job for him, and Herb might have been resistant to stop the fight as a result. But the big tell here is at the legs. There's really no attempt to like regard or kind of adjust his angle in a defensive posture with the lower half of the body for Herbert, and I think that was the big tell, that he was out or he wasn't really like fully defending himself or wasn't intelligently defending himself. So Herb Dean sort of let it go, where Herbert was just kind of like stuck still in that same defense where he's covering his chin and he was reaching out with one arm. So as a result, Trinaldo realizes that Herb Dean isn't stepping in, throws a few more punches. As those punches land, it looks like Herbert finally is like coming back to consciousness. But after a few of those punches land, Herb Dean stops the fight, and then Herbert kind of like crawls up and ends up like getting up to his knees without any help. So sort of an odd flash knockout where he was out for a few seconds there. Sort of odd how the finish worked out. And obviously Paul Felder and Dan Hardy were very displeased with Herb Dean for not stepping in immediately and stopping the fight then. They're like, well, look, we get that Herbert was winning, but with that being said, your job is to protect the fighters. That fighter was out. Trinaldo saw it. He was out. Trinaldo was doing the right thing by not landing any more shots that needed to be landed. You forced him to do that, so that wasn't necessarily right. I'll cover this more specifically when I actually get to the topic on Dan Hardy. But it's one of those ones where it's like, should Herb Dean have stepped in earlier? I would say yes. This was a late stoppage for Herb Dean, primarily because during that time we didn't see any movement on the lower half of Herbert's body, and he was just kind of frozen on the upper half. So I think even though if you just look at a freeze frame, it looked like Herbert might have been defending himself, the lack of movement on the lower half of the body I think was a big tell there, and Herb Dean should have stepped in. Now with that being said, is Herbert so much worse off for taking those 3 or 4 extra punches than he would have otherwise been had Herb Dean stepped in a little earlier? I don't know about that. He seemed okay when he was getting back up to his knees, but with that being said, it was a bit of a late stoppage, but it's not one where I was like freaking out about it while I was watching. It was just a tad bit late, and a few extra punches than what were needed. But before that was Jesse Ronson versus Nicholas Dalby. Dalby was a big favorite in this fight. Ronson was able to land a really big, I believe it was an overhand right to drop Dalby, and then when Dalby was hurt, Ronson got on top, was able to advance to his back, sink into a rear naked choke and get the win. We had a fight between Jake Collier, who I believe he used to fight at middleweight. I feel like I was at one of his fights back when he was at middleweight, but here he was at heavyweight looking way out of shape, and Aspinall had no trouble with him, was able to knock him down pretty quickly and then finish him on the ground. So a 45-second KO for Tom Aspinall. Really bad luck for Collier for him to have to move up 2 weight classes and then get knocked out this quickly. Not good for him. Then we had a fight between Mike Grundy and Movsar Evloviev. For the most part, Grundy was the one who was wrestling in this fight. I think for the most part, Evloviev, or Evloev, however that's pronounced, Evloviev. His first name is Movsar. We'll call him Movsar. That'll be easier. So for Movsar, I think for the most part, he likes to take guys down and control them. But Grundy has a really good wrestling background, and for the most part, Grundy was the one who was trying to wrestle in this fight. Landed a handful of takedowns, but really wasn't able to control Movsar for the most part when he got him down. There was a moment in the first round where he looked like he was pretty close to getting a Darce choke. And I think for that reason, he was able to win that first round on one of the judges' scorecards. But for the most part, Movsar was able to defend most of the takedowns, get up pretty quickly, and was able to do much better on the feet than Grundy was. So he gets the win. We had another fight between Tanner Boser and Rafael Pessoa. Not the most exciting fight up until the second round when Boser was able to land a really nice shot with a left hook to the eye of Pessoa. From there, Pessoa, you could tell that his eye was hurt, but you could tell it was a punch, so you're not going to stop the fight there and give him time to recover with his eye because it was a punch. Boser then looks to rush him up against the cage. Rather than knocking him down and knocking him off its equilibrium, it looked as though Pessoa just sort of dropped just to cover up his eye, and then covered it up against the fence. And this was another fight that people were giving Herb Dean crap for. This one is a little bit tougher to me because when you have a situation like that where someone gets hit in the eye and they go down sort of on their own accord, it's not necessarily clear what they are looking to do. So if you get hit to the body or you get hit to the eye, for example, you might not necessarily be out of it, in terms of your mental capacity. Obviously, if you're getting hit in the eye and you're not rocked, you're still there. If you get hit in the body, your brain's still there. But in some cases, when people take those shots, that's it for them, and they just want to cover up and wait until the ref steps in. For other ones, they're going to try to cover up and kill some time, but try to find a way to stay in that fight. And it wasn't necessarily clear with Pessoa. It's pretty clear that he wasn't close to losing consciousness after getting hit in the eye. And then once he goes down, you don't know whether or not he's going to try to cover up, block a couple shots, and then try to get an overhook on Tanner Boser's arm, and then just try to hold him there in place and try to stall out and kill some time, which is a perfectly reasonable thing for him to do. Or if he's just going to stay curled up in a ball and wait until Herb Dean steps in and stops the fight. And so for Herb Dean, when this is what you're having to deal with, you kind of have to give Pessoa the chance to take a few shots and at least give him the chance to show whether he's going to try to turn it into a grappling exchange and at least close the distance on Tanner Boser, sort of pretty much pull him on top of you, maybe keep him in a half guard or a closed guard or whatever you can really manage to keep him into, and just sort of keep him tight on you and keep him from really being able to land any more shots to that eye, just so you can kill some time and work your way back into the fight. Or if you're just going to look to cover up and wait until Herb Dean steps in to stop the fight. So in Pessoa's case, rather than trying to find a way to recover here and stay in the fight, it looked as though his idea was that he was just going to cover up the entire time and wait for Herb Dean to step in. Now, with that being said, as Herb Dean's watching this, he's watching Tanner Boser land pretty much every single shot that he lands directly onto the forearms of Pessoa, meaning pretty much every single shot that Boser was landing on the ground was being blocked. And as a ref, you always hear on Twitter, it seems like, oh, look how many unanswered strikes there were. It's a big difference between an unanswered strike that actually lands on the head and an unanswered strike that's blocked. And pretty much every one of these strikes were blocked. So for Herb Dean, initially you want to give Pessoa the chance to take a few shots just to see if he's going to actually try to improve his position. But also when the shots are getting blocked, that's going to reduce your urgency to step in and stop the fight. Then if the shots are getting through clean, pretty much every shot he's looking at is getting blocked. So could he have stepped in a little bit earlier there? I think most people noticed early enough, or at least noticed earlier than Herb Dean had acted, that Pessoa didn't have any intention of actually improving his position there, that he was just waiting for Herb Dean to stop it. But with that being said, for Herb Dean, you got to at least let him take a few shots there to see if he's going to try to improve position. And when you're seeing every single shot get blocked, it's sort of like, which block shot is the one that you decide, okay, yes, he's blocking this shot too, but he's had so many block shots without improving his position that we're going to have to step in and stop it. And it seemed like he gave Pessoa a few more shots there than he needed to, but again, pretty much every shot that Boser threw was blocked. Was he a little bit late on this one? Yes, but again, what damage has caused Pessoa as a result? Pretty much none, I would say. It looks like pretty much every shot that was considered that you would deem an extra shot was also blocked. So yeah, maybe Pessoa's forearms might be a little more sore than they have to be, but it's not as though he was hung out to dry here and took a bunch of damage that he shouldn't have had to take. So again, is it a late stoppage for Herb Dean? I'd say a little late, but it's not as though this is one that I'm really all that upset about. I will say it is kind of funny that Herb Dean has 2 stoppages in this fight, or on this card, that are considered really late. And it seems like it was a little less than a year ago that we had Aspen Ladd taking him to court and like calling out like some sort of like gender discrimination because he stopped that fight too early in her opinion. So it's funny to see Herb Dean sort of go the other way, where back then everyone's like, yeah, Herb Dean stops fights way too early. Aspen Ladd's right. Like Herb Dean needs to give these guys a chance to defend themselves, and now we have Herb Dean going the other way, and it seems like now everyone's forgot about all the things they were saying back then. They're like, oh no, Herb Dean just lets these guys die out there, and he needs to step in sooner, and he doesn't protect his fighters well enough. So it's kind of funny how it works out that way, but as far as what I saw from Herb Dean, could he have stepped in earlier on those 2 fights? Yes. What additional harm was caused by him not stepping in earlier than he had? Not a ton. So then we move on from there to Betch Kohara versus Pannie Kianzad. It's really interesting with Betch that it feels like it's like 4 or 5 years ago, if not more, since she fought Ronda Rousey and was like beating up Ronda Rousey's training partners and earning that title fight. And I'm just trying to think of like what her game was then and what her game is now and what kind of improvements have really been made since then. I'm really not saying a whole lot. So in this fight with Pannie, first round somewhat close. I think Pannie was still a little bit ahead of it. But then when they had the 10-second clapper go off, Betch, who's been fighting for quite a while should probably know what the 10-second clapper is, thinks that the round's over, so she pretty much stops fighting and then takes a bunch of really hard unanswered shots. So that definitely took the round for Pannie. Second round looked pretty good for Kianzad as well. Betch had a couple takedowns here and there, landed a few nice shots here and there, but for the most part, Pannie looked much better and was able to get the win in this fight. We had Ramzan Amia versus Nicholas Stolze. Amia was able to win this fight largely through his wrestling. And then Nathaniel Wood versus John Castaneda. Nathaniel Wood outstruck Castaneda for the most part and was having a lot of success with his right hand. So that covers it for this card. Next topic to talk about is going to be sort of rehashing what I was just talking about, so that's going to be Dan Hardy. So I'll start with Dan Hardy getting in Herb Dean's face about this. And I guess, first off, one of the annoying things about these no fan events is that it seems like the announcers have a lot more power than they really should. I really didn't care too much when Daniel Cormier was like talking about how Greg Hardy could check kicks, and Greg Hardy starts checking kicks, and he's like, wow, thanks, Daniel Cormier. Like, that's a really basic thing that Hardy's corner should have been able to tell him. But it seems like with Michael Bisping, for example, Bisping gets really loud every time a large shot lands, and you kind of wonder like how much of an effect that's going to have on the judges relative to what would be in a normal situation. No, I guess the argument there would be that under normal circumstances, the crowd also gets loud for shots that they think land really hard, and that could also have a similar effect. But it is kind of annoying sometimes to hear the echo between like the feed that's taking Michael Bisping's voice and directly putting that on the broadcast, and also hearing it as like background noise as well. But one of the things that kind of bothered me about this event was that every time Paul Felder and Dan Hardy were just start screaming at Herb Dean, that you could also kind of hear the echo of that, and you knew that Herb Dean heard it as well. And so you kind of have like these commentators just like screaming and yelling at Herb Dean on how to do his job. And as tough as that sort of situation is, I think the worst part is that Dan Hardy felt the need to like actually get in Herb Dean's face after the second stoppage, the one with Jai Herbert, and to actually like tell him pretty much how to do his job and how wrong he was. I kind of wish that we had the audio for that so we could hear what was said. But with that being said, I think Dan Hardy's completely out of line for this, and it's not that I don't know that Dan Hardy wasn't right. I think Dan Hardy, if his point is that that fight with Jai Herbert was stopped late, I think he is correct about that. But with that being said, Dan Hardy is not teaching Herb Dean anything when it comes to how to stop a fight or when a fight should be stopped. Herb Dean knows full well when a fight should be stopped. He knows full well that if a fighter is no longer defending themselves or if they're no longer conscious, the ref's job is to step in. As a ref, especially as a ref like Herb Dean, you may know all these things, but with that being said, applying it in a specific case on the spot, in a fast-moving sport, sometimes you're going to be a little bit late. Sometimes you might be a little bit early. Sometimes it's going to happen. So for Dan Hardy to think that he has to explain to Herb Dean something that Herb Dean is fully aware of, I think is ridiculous. For him to be screaming at Herb Dean the way that he was, like, in terms of winning an argument, you're never going to win someone over to your side by handling it the way that Dan Hardy did, by screaming at a guy, by telling him something that he already knows, and like doing it in such a fashion where it seemed as though he was just kind of like talking down to him. I really had an issue with the way that Dan Hardy was handling the whole situation. Herb Dean knows what he's doing. Herb Dean is known as one of the best refs in the game. Did Herb Dean mess up on that call? You could definitely say so, but to address him the way that Dan Hardy did, to have the attitude that Dan Hardy did, to be like, oh, it's your job to protect us fighters. As a broadcaster, it's okay if I'm a little bit off someday, but you could have these guys just maim for life. How dare you? Like, you're not telling Herb Dean anything he doesn't know. All you're doing is acting like a little whiny little prick. And quite frankly, like Dan Hardy, your job there is as an announcer. Your job isn't like as a regulator who's like Herb Dean's boss in any way. So for you to have to like try to pull him over and explain to him how he did his job wrong and he needs to protect the fighters, it just literally nothing is accomplished by Dan Hardy doing what he did there, other than Dan Hardy feeling good about himself. That's really the only thing that gets accomplished there. Herb Dean isn't like, oh wow, Dan Hardy, you just taught me something new that I didn't know already. Like, Dan Hardy is doing zero helpful things by him calling over Herb Dean and him trashing Herb Dean on the broadcast. The only thing helpful that Dan Hardy is doing is he's helping his own little ego, and so he can feel better about himself. That's all that's being accomplished there. So I really had an issue with him doing that. Now, as far as a couple other things that Dan Hardy got involved in, one of them was him breaking down Paulo Costa and pretty much just saying that he felt as though his technique was really lacking, that he'd be in big trouble with Adesanya. I mean, that's up to Dan Hardy if he feels that way. I actually am relatively impressed with Boashinia's technique. I think he's got very fast hands. He's really good at mixing up to the body and the head, and I think being able to mix to the body is a really big detail. That's something I actually missed in the Darren Till versus Robert Whittaker breakdown. So I guess I'll bring it up now that I actually remembered it. But one of the other issues that I saw Darren Till having is that a lot of his punches were going towards the head of Robert Whittaker. He wasn't really aiming towards the body a whole lot. There were a couple of leg kicks here and there, but for the most part, Till was primarily looking to go to the head. There were a few different situations where he was looking to line up the left hand, and Whittaker just sort of ducked down, and for the most part, if there wasn't an uppercut there, Till wasn't finding a home for his shots there, so I think Darren Till could have done a better job of going to the body. Anyway, with that being said, back to what we're talking about here. For him to rip into Paulo Costa and say that his striking is very technical or his grappling is very technical, I think Paulo's got a black belt in jiu-jitsu. Whatever grappling we've seen from him recently, like he's been very solid in every position he's been in. As far as his wrestling goes, he's winning against some really good wrestlers and been able to either get back up quickly or stuff takedowns, including the Yoel Romero fight. So from a technical standpoint, there's plenty of good things to say about Paulo. To really rip into him as a guy who like has major technical flaws and is just going to get completely destroyed by someone like Adesanya, I don't know that that's necessarily fair, but again, that's his opinion, so whatever. I'm not too upset about that. I think he's a little bit off on it, but that's his thoughts. But the thing that I thought was really ridiculous was him having a question. I don't remember if it was on Twitter where the question came up first or if it was on a show, but I did see an exchange on Twitter where there's like a 15-year-old who was like, hey, I'm 15, I'm looking to get into MMA right now. Is it too late for me if I want to like make a career of this or if I want to be a champion? To which Dan Hardy said, yes, you're way too late, and then was trying to like urge the kid from getting into MMA as a result, or urge him not to. It's so again, if that's what Dan Hardy believes, like he's entitled to believe that. I can understand the thought process there, where he's thinking, okay, well, right now we have a lot of really young kids who are getting into it right now. So if you're starting at 15, you're starting behind a lot of them, and they have a head start on you. But with that being said, if you look at other combat sports, including wrestling, which has been around for quite a while, though it's not the most common thing, it's definitely a thing that happens a decent amount, where you have a guy who gets into high school, 15, I believe I was a freshman when I was 15 in high school, but their freshman year they try out for the wrestling team, um, probably have a really bad freshman year, sophomore year they get okay, maybe like junior and senior they really starting to get into their own, maybe even win a state title, get into D1 wrestling, and then from there are able to work their way up and eventually become like a D1 champion by the time they're 22. Um, and if that's the level of wrestling you can get to after starting at 15, it would make sense to think that if you're starting at 15 and you're also doing jiu-jitsu in the off-season, or if you're also like working on striking as well, that you can be at a level where if your wrestling's at a really high level, if you're jiu-jitsu, I mean, especially if you're really into it, and you have a high-level wrestling background as well, starting at 15, by the time that you're 25, for sure, you can definitely be at a black belt level in jiu-jitsu, which would then give you 10 plus years as a black belt, if not more, depending on how long you want to stay in MMA. The striking can definitely improve over that time if you have a really athletic build, if you have a really explosive muscles, and you're really good at, I guess fast twitch is the term to use, but if you have if you're built more with like fast twitch muscles, like your striking can probably improve really quickly over that period of time. Like it's definitely reasonable to think that someone starting at 15 could definitely work their way into the UFC for sure, but then also going beyond the UFC, just on the roster to being at a point where they're ranked or even able to earn their way to a title fight. Is it likely? I mean, most people who do any kind of sport are not going to make it to the top of it, let alone become a champion. Like most people who pick up basketball aren't going to get to the NBA, let alone be an NBA champion. Most people who pick up tennis aren't going to make it to the ATP, let alone be like a Wimbledon champion. So I think for most people who pick up MMA, they're not going to make it to the UFC, let alone be a UFC champion. So from a broad sense, that's true. But to say that someone starting at 15 can't make it to the UFC is ridiculous. To say that someone starting at 15 can't make it to the top of the UFC at some point, that also seems ridiculous to me as well. So I thought he was way off on that and was just effectively like tearing down this kid's dreams, making an argument that I didn't really agree with. Next topic to talk about is going to be the upcoming fight card. That's going to be UFC Fight Night, Brunson versus Shahbazyan. This will be at the Apex. I don't know what their hashtag's going to be, like UFC Apex 4 or whatever number at the Apex it's going to be. But either way, main event's going to be Derek Brunson versus Edmund Shahbazyan. Seems like with Shahbazyan, they're trying to give him a similar path to what they gave Israel Adesanya, where Adesanya had Brad Tavares, then he had Derek Brunson, and then he worked his way up from there. I don't know that Shahbazyan is going to get a shot at Anderson Silva next, but it seems like they're looking to give him a similar path and see how he handles it. But he's looked really good so far. Had that knockout over Brad Tavares. Now he's going to have an opportunity with Derek Brunson. Brunson, you would imagine, is going to try to get a takedown here, get Shahbazyan down, look to beat him up on the ground. Shahbazyan, from what we've seen so far, pretty good at defending takedowns, and on the feet has looked excellent as well. So I think the expectation here would be that Shahbazyan is able to knock out Derek Brunson and do so pretty quickly. In the co-main event, Joanne Calderwood, who had been waiting for a title shot for a while, is tired of waiting for a title shot, so she's going to return to the cage against Jennifer Maia. We'll have Vicente Luque versus Randy Brown. This should be a pretty fun fight at welterweight. For Luque, won't be fighting up against a ranked guy. Randy Brown's still pretty dangerous, though, pretty good striker with decent grappling. So this will be a fun one to watch. We'll have Lando Venata versus Bobby Green. Anytime, pretty much either of these guys fight, it's always a fun fight. Venata's really fun to watch. Hasn't had the best record in the UFC, but has had some moments. I think everyone's always going to remember that moment where he had his debut up against Tony Ferguson and had Ferguson hurt in the first round, prior to Ferguson being able to turn the tide and eventually finish him. And then for Bobby Green, had a really fun fight with Clay Guida recently, and he'll be returning pretty quickly to fight Venata. And then we'll have Kevin Holland versus Trevin Giles. On the prelims, we have Frankie Saenz versus Jonathan Martinez, Ed Herman versus Gerald Mearshot at light heavyweight, so Herman will still be at 205. Mearshot will be bumping up a weight class to take on Herman here. Ray Borg returns again, going up against Nate Maness. I think this will be the debut for Maness. He's 11-1. Borg is really needing a win right now, so hopefully for him he's able to get it. Eric Spicely will be fighting up against Marcus Perez. This should be a pretty fun one at middleweight. We'll have Jamal Emmers versus Timur Valiev, and then Chris Gutierrez versus what ESPN.com is saying, an opponent TBA. So we'll have to see from there. I guess I'll also throw in Bellator really quickly. I didn't mention it initially, but I'll kind of fit this one in as well. But a recap for Bellator, they had a little event that they put on. Main event was Sergio Pettis versus Ricky Bandejas. Pettis was able to outstrike Bandejas for much of this fight, was able to get the win. Jordan Mean versus Jason Jackson. Jackson was able to get a unanimous decision win there. And then the other big fight worth mentioning is Aaron Pico versus Chris Hatley. Pico was able to return, looked really good. Rather than just trying to box with everyone like he has in the past, was able to get a pretty quick takedown here. Eventually got Hatley's back and was able to sink in a rear naked choke. Tywon Claxton also fought on this card, lost a split decision to J.J. Wilson, so that's also worth bringing up. So from here, next topic to talk about is going to be boxing. Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. As far as this actual fight, is it a fight that I'm probably going to watch or like find a way to get a stream of? I mean, most likely. But with that being said, this fight is effectively meaningless. If Mike Tyson beats Roy Jones Jr., what does that mean for Mike Tyson? Like, a win over Roy Jones Jr. in 2020 means what for him? Like, do we pretend that means he would have beat him like 20 years ago? Does it really like affect their legacy either way? Not really. If Roy Jones Jr. beats Mike Tyson right now, like, what does a win over Mike Tyson in 2020 mean for Roy Jones Jr.? Not really much. It's not as though the winner of this fight is someone who people are going to be like, oh, wow, like this guy can contend for a heavyweight championship right now in 2020 or moving forward in 2021. So it effectively has no meaning to it. But with that being said, it's still two really big name guys from years past. And I think for that reason, people are going to want to see these guys fighting. They're going to want to see the actual event. So in a way, it sort of like has like this bit of a circus appeal to it. But it's not as though whoever wins is going to be a lot meaningful. But with that being said, when's the last time you got to see Mike Tyson fight? It's been quite a while. Well, now you're going to have another chance to watch him again, so you're probably going to do it. So, as a novelty, I'm probably going to watch this, but for the sport of boxing, it just doesn't seem all that important other than just bringing eyes to boxing and getting more people to watch boxing again. But in terms of either of these guys, like, building off of this and then working their way towards the title picture or towards a meaningful fight, I just don't see that. So, it'll be fun, but it's really not going to be all that important. Next topic to talk about is going to be a couple of people who are talking about going to MMA. One of them had been talking about going to MMA like 5 years ago and then got injured and then decided to just keep sticking at it in jiu-jitsu and has racked up a bunch of world titles since then. So that's Marcus Buchecha Almeida. So right now he's 30 years old, and the announcement was just made that he's no longer going to be doing gi jiu-jitsu competition. He'll still do some no-gi competition. So I don't know if that means he'll be doing ADCC in 2021. But he'll be doing no-gi, but he's also going to be transitioning to MMA. Back when he was 25, he was talking about doing this. He was training with AKA, some of the guys over there. As far as jiu-jitsu guys going to MMA, there could be an argument made that Buchecha is the best jiu-jitsu guy to ever do MMA. I guess the other guy who one would argue would be better than Buchecha is Roger Gracie. Roger did get a win over Buchecha in the gi, I believe it was a couple of years ago. Now with that being said, I think these guys have only gone against each other twice, once at Metamoris and then once at that event. So Roger was able to get to his back and choke him with his gi. I'm trying to think if it was like a Ezekiel from the back or if it was just like a regular lapel choke. But either way, he was able to get a finish on Buchecha there on the gi. But then the first match they had at Metamoris had those weird rules where it's like if you don't get a submission, then we just call it a draw. But Buchecha absolutely dominated that first match against Roger, but Roger didn't get finished, so it was called a draw. But effectively speaking, these guys are 1-1 against each other. Buchecha has, I believe, more world titles than Roger Gracie does. But either way, both these guys are incredibly high level, so for Buchecha to come over, it's definitely something exciting. With that being said, Roger Gracie, in terms of his success in MMA, was fairly limited. Did make it to Strikeforce, had some decent fights there, made it to the UFC. I believe he lost to Tim Kennedy before he was out of the UFC, but for Roger, his striking was never really all that great. The wrestling wasn't always great, and a lot of guys knew better than to bring the fight to the mat with him. And so he had some struggles there. For Buchecha, when I talk about jiu-jitsu guys transitioning to MMA, one of the big things for them is being able to get the fight to the mat and then also being able to control from there and work their way towards the finish. I think if Buchecha gets most guys to the mat, especially if he's at heavyweight, he'll be in a really good position. It's just his wrestling is decent, but it's not as though he was like known as like a fantastic wrestler in the division. I think a guy like Rodolfo Vieira was known for having better stand-up than Buchecha was. Buchecha and Rodolfo actually had a bit of a rivalry where Rodolfo had won like 4 or 5 world titles, and then he started running into Buchecha, and for whatever reason, Buchecha was just like the kryptonite for Rodolfo. But in terms of these guys transitioning to MMA, I don't know that Buchecha is, especially at the higher weight classes, is going to be able to like blast double through a bunch of guys, drag them to the mat, and then be able to implement his game. So his striking is going to be an important aspect for him. From the limited video that we've seen of him hitting pads, there's definitely a lot of room for improvement there. He is 30 years old right now, so he's starting at 30. That doesn't give him a whole lot of time to really improve his striking or really improve his wrestling. So while he does fight there, I'm sure he'll have a handful of fights where he's able to get the fights to the ground and looks fantastic. But in terms of him being a future MMA star or a future UFC champion, I'm not super high on that, and I also think that the fact that he had talked about getting into MMA 5 years ago and one injury pretty much derailed it sort of tells me that his desire to be in MMA is kind of limited, and once he starts having to face some difficulties, that he might not necessarily be that eager to push through. Not to say that he like is mentally weak or anything, but you have to actually want something really bad to push through. In MMA, you can be super mentally strong, but if you're really not that into, if you're just not that into it mentally, you may decide it's not worth your time to go through the struggle that is involved in MMA. So for Buchecha, I don't know that he's going to stick around long enough for him to get offers from the UFC or some of the other top promotions. And if he does, I have a feeling that just given the amount of time that he's wasted, that he could have been spending on working on important details for MMA in terms of his wrestling, in terms of his striking, that his ceiling is going to be a little bit limited in that way. The other name to talk about is Frank Chamizo. So he is a world champion at, I believe, 74 kilograms is where he won his world title, but fantastic wrestler. Just had a match with Kyle Dake that was really tight. Ended up losing it, but it was really close. At the end, Chamizo was in close on a takedown attempt, only lost by a point. So obviously, world-class wrestler. If he does get into MMA, that'd be really fun to watch. Would be one of the best wrestlers to transition over to MMA as well. He had an interview with Ben Askren leading into the event that he had this weekend, where he pretty much told him that after 2021 that he'd be looking at doing that. Now, is that just him like trying to say something fun for the sake of an interview, or is that him like actually saying, "Hey, look, this is what I want to do with my life moving forward. I want to be done with wrestling. I want to focus on MMA." That's sort of hard to tell. So I'm not necessarily going to make it out to be like this is a full announcement from Chamizo and that we're going to get Chamizo in MMA in 2021, but it is something that he mentioned, and I feel like for a name as big as Frank Chamizo, if he's going to talk about going into MMA, that it's probably worth my time just to mention that on this podcast. Next topic to talk about is going to be Flow Grappling. So they had a couple events that are worth mentioning. So one of them is the BJJ Stars event that just happened. That was down in Brazil. Had a lot of really high-level matches on it. Let me see if I can pull up the results here. Let's see. Yeah, so they don't have like a full list of all the results here, but I watched most of them, so I can at least go from the top of the card. I'm going to have to go back and watch the match that we had with Charles Oliveira, assuming that he was still on that card. But main event was Joao Gabriel Rocha versus Kaynan Duarte. This match was sort of an odd one in that it was mostly just kind of like a seesaw battle from 50-50 where Kaynan was on bottom first, so he was able to get the first sweep, so swept Rocha swept him back, and it ended up being a 6-4 score for Kaynan. But with a couple minutes left, Rocha appeared to injure his knee in one of those 50-50 exchanges. Sort of weird that they stopped the match then when he kind of like screamed out in pain, and then restarted it later. You kind of would figure that would be considered like a verbal tap, but either way, there wasn't really a submission being applied, so they just decided to give him some time to recover, let him continue, but he ended up losing. Then we had Leandro Lover. This is Lucas Barboza. Barboza gets a really quick takedown on Low, really heavy pressure from top. Low was never really all that close to sweeping him. There was a moment where Barboza was able to get really close to getting a pass on Leandro Low, pretty close to actually sticking it and getting the 3 points for the pass, but Low was able to do enough to keep him off of him. Eventually recovers his guard, but Barboza was able to score a couple of different advantages in that exchange. And then towards the end of the match, when it seemed as though Leandro Low had to do something really, really big, not only to make up the 2 points that he was down, but then also to make up the advantages. Barboza was able to get close to taking his back, didn't have both hooks in, so he didn't score the points for it, but then was also threatening with a choke towards the end. So pretty dominant performance from Lucas Barboza with a win over Leandro Low. That's a really big win for him to get. Patrick Guardia versus Herberto Santos, really good back and forth match. Guardia was able to get the win there. We had Claudio Calasanz versus Isaac Bahiennes. Again, Claudio looked pretty good early on in this match, but Isaac was able to get an early sweep. And then from there, eventually was able to catch an Ezekiel choke from the back. So he won that match. Bianca Basilio versus Ana Rodriguez. I sort of lost... I was watching the fights and I was watching this at the same time, so I didn't really see what happened here for Rodriguez to win. The brief moments I was watching, Basilio looked like she was ahead. But Rodriguez was able to get a win in this match. Leo Leite versus Gabriel Gonzaga, I didn't catch that. The one match I did catch was Sergio Moraes versus Luis Marquez, which I thought was really interesting, and that Moraes looked like he was way bigger than what we've seen in the UFC. He's fought at 170 in the UFC and looked like... this looked like a heavyweight match. Then all of a sudden I'm like, wait, that guy looks like Sergio Moraes. Is that him? Turn the sound on, and then Turns out, yeah, that actually was Sergio Moraes. But either way, he did win this match, so I guess good for him on that end. Next thing to talk about with grappling, though, is an event coming up this coming week. So that's going to be on July 31st, which will be a Friday. And that's going to be Who's Number One. 3 really big matches that are going to be on this card right now that they've announced so far. They have Gordon Ryan versus Ronaldo Jr. Ronaldo Jr. recently got his black belt. It looked really good for Team Atos. They're pretty much running out of guys to up against Gordon Ryan. So Ronaldo called out Gordon, so they gave Ronaldo the match. Ronaldo's, again, high-level black belt, very, very good, had a lot of great performances. So it's not as though this is a guy who doesn't deserve a shot at Gordon Ryan, but I don't think anyone really expects him to win, especially in a no-gi match. That's going to be no time limit, sub only. Co-main event, we're going to get a rematch from the third-place match at ADCC between Dante Leon and Gary Tonin. Gary had won that match by heel hook. So it's sort of hard to predict this match going any differently, but with that being said, Dante's looked really good since then. Dante won the no-gi Worlds. Granted, Gary Tonin was not in that bracket, but Dante did win amongst the bracket that he was in. Has looked pretty good since then as well. And then we also have a really fun match with Craig Jones and Lucas Barboza. Barboza, as I just mentioned, beat Leandro Lowe at BJJ Stars, so he'll be coming up to Texas really quickly to take on this match here against Craig Jones. Sort of interesting to go from Leandro Lowe, who is one of the all-time great gi competitors. Got to win over him there if he can then go on and face Craig Jones. Now, granted, Barboza is bigger than Craig Jones. Barboza fought in the 99 kilogram division at ECC. Craig Jones fought at the 88 kilogram division, so he's fighting a smaller guy. But with that being said, if you can go from beating Leandro Lowe to then beating Leandro Lowe in the gi to beating Craig Jones in no gi over the course of a week, that's a hell of a week for Lucas Hulk Barboza. So that's going to be an opportunity that he has. So that covers it for jiu-jitsu. For wrestling, Flowrestling put on a card marred by technical difficulties, made it pretty unwatchable. A lot of really long breaks between matches as well. But in the main event, we got Frank Chamizo versus Kyle Dake. Really tight match. Kyle Dake was the first one put on a shot clock. Had a point taken against him, but was able to get a push out late in the first period to tie it up at 1-1 and have the edge on criteria. Chamizo scored the first takedown, but Dake scrambled out of it really quickly and was able to reverse him really quickly. Weird rule in freestyle in that if you get a reversal, it doesn't score the same as a takedown. So in folk style or in college wrestling, if I take you down, I get 2 points for the takedown, and then if you reverse me and then you end up on top, you get 2 points for the reversal, so we're even. Whereas in freestyle wrestling, if I take you down but then you quickly reverse me, I get 2 for the takedown and you get 1 for the reversal. So I would actually be ahead even though you were on top at the end of the exchange. So it's sort of weird, but that's how it ended up working out. So Dake was behind a little bit. But Dake was eventually able to get a takedown of his own. Or at least was able to get a push out of his own. Or actually, no, it was the reversal is what put him down 1, and then he got a turn from there to make it 4-3. And then with that 4-3, he was able to hang on at the end. Chamizo was pretty close to taking him down to the end there, though, but Dake did a good job defending and was able to hang on for the win. Another match on that card was Miles Martin versus David Taylor. It should have been Pat Downey versus David Taylor, but Downey was taken off the card, so instead we got Miles Martin. Miles Martin's good, but the Pat Downey match is the one that people really wanted to see. But either way, David Taylor just ran right through Miles Martin, won by a score of 11-0. And we had a few other matches on there with some current college wrestlers. We had Roman Bravo Young versus Jack Mueller. Roman Bravo Young, 133-pounder for Penn State, versus Mueller, who was a very oversized 125-pounder for Virginia, but made it to the NCAA finals last year. Looked as though he had a good shot at making it this year as well before everything ended up shutting down. But RBY was able to get the win in that match. We had Luke Pletcher, who was the number 1 guy in the nation at 141 pounds, going up against Darren Caldwell, a former NCAA champion who's been fighting for Bellator for the last few years. And Pletcher, who's actively been wrestling right now, ended up being the guy who won the wrestling match. Not a major surprise there, but Caldwell did show pretty well for himself. And then there was also a match between Sammy Alvarez, 133-pounder for Rutgers, who's looked really good this year, going up against Vito Arujau, who's looked really good last year at 125 pounds for Cornell and decided to take the year off to prepare for the Olympics. And Vito was able to win that match. So that covers it for this week. A lot of great matches that we got between UFC. Bellator is back, which was nice. We had a really good jiu-jitsu event, really good wrestling event. Next week, the UFC event we're going to get is not going to be quite as good as what we got this week, but it'll still be a fun one. We're going to get a good jiu-jitsu event with Who's Number One. Nothing to look forward to in wrestling necessarily for this week, but again, it's nice to see combat sports are back. It's nice to see that we're getting a lot of events again. I would like to see some larger crowds, but hey, we're slowly working our way back to normal, and you can't be too mad about that.